The Sweetser Lecture Committee would like to thank everybody who supported the series this year by buying tickets, and especially the Wakefield Savings Bank, our benefactors, and our patrons, including Gregory's, who lent us these beautiful plants on the stage here. And I thank the Sweetser Lecture Committee for inviting Rick Beyer to speak tonight and letting me introduce him to you. He has a take on history that's humorous and illuminating. He has appeared on CBS News, MSNBC, CNN, the Discovery Channel, and NPR, and probably a few other places. I'm sure some of you, many of you, were here a few years ago when Rick spoke about the Ghost Army of World War II. At that time, I may have mentioned that although I constantly read, I read mainly fiction. And I hardly ever read nonfiction, and even less likely a nonfiction book about World War II. Well, that changed a little bit when Rick first hooked me on his Greatest Stories Never Told series. And then it was followed by other greatest stories, science, presidents, music, and that was followed by the book on World War II, The Ghost Army, and that was a very interesting read. I am also usually interested in seeing new musicians when they come, or musicals when they come to Boston. And I'm sure some of you are hoping that you're going to score tickets to Hamilton next fall. I know many of you would love to go. And again, I'm thinking a play about a duel from way back then. This is not really what I would want to see. I can't even imagine going. But then Rick Beyer was given the task to write a book about the famous duel between Hamilton and Burr. So then, of course, I had to read the book. So here you are, and here's Rick Beyer, the award-winning documentary filmmaker, best-selling author, and longtime history enthusiast, to let you on Rivals to Death. My friend Rick Beyer, welcome back to Wakefield.
So much. You know, I haven't been in Wakefield in 2 years, and I wasn't sure how things had changed. So I came on. 7:30 a.m., Wednesday, July 11th, 1804, Aaron Burr stood on an isolated clearing below the cliffs of Weehawken, New Jersey, holding a pistol. Just so. 30 feet away stood Alexander Hamilton, holding an identical pistol. The same two pistols had been used on the exact same spot in a duel that killed Hamilton's son 3 years earlier. On this morning, Burr watched with icy disdain as Hamilton briefly held up the proceedings to fiddle with his glasses. Burr thought he read fear in Hamilton's eyes. He looked like a convicted felon, he said. Finally, when both men were ready, Hamilton's second, Nathaniel Pendleton, shouted, "Present!" What transpired in the next few seconds, and in what order, was bitterly contested by those present and has been argued about for 2 centuries. What is certain is this: Aaron Burr leveled his Wagner dueling pistol at Alexander Hamilton and pulled the trigger. And boy, we went right by the sound effect too, which is awesome. So anyway, wow. Got me in the back. A .50 caliber lead ball left the muzzle at a speed of approximately 545 miles per hour, traversed the distance between the two men in less than a 20th of a second, pierced Hamilton's abdomen, ricocheted into off of a rib, plowed into his liver, and mortally wounded him. And there it is. I've done it. I'm supposed to take this mic here. I've done it. I've given away the ending of my book. This is a murder mystery in which there is no mystery at all about who pulled the trigger. We know that Aaron Burr shot Alexander Hamilton. The mystery is in the why. The mystery is in the hearts of these two men. 1 week before the duel, just 1 week before the duel, holy moly, it's going to be that kind of night, folks. Well, 1 week before the duel, the two men sat side by side at France's Tavern at a convivial July 4th dinner. And there were toasts and songs and jests and rum punch and Madeira float like water. And there they were, the sitting Vice President of the United States and the former Secretary of the Treasury, sitting side by side, as close as you two guys right here. And to all the world, seeming as if they were enjoying the dinner, when in fact they had already set in motion their murderous plan to meet on the dueling ground. So how can this be? How could they sit side by side in complete calmness, yet be so filled with rage that they were determined to shoot it out a few days later? And that's what we all want to know, right? What makes the story even more interesting is that in Hamilton and Burr, we have two complex characters whose passions and whose arguments capture the conflicts that beset our young nation 200 years ago, and in many ways still beset it today. So thank you for coming tonight. I'm delighted to be back in Wakefield for the Sweetser lecture series. I want to thank Liz for that wonderful introduction. I also want to thank her for all the books that she's bought over the years. She's like a one-person source of income, I think, for our family. But she's always giving these books to various people, and I really, really appreciate that and appreciate her helping us out. I note that I came last time and I was talking about lying and deceit. Now here I am talking about political intrigue and murder. I'm delighted to be able to bring some light entertainment and some mayhem to my friends in Wakefield. How many people here, let me ask, have actually seen the stage show Hamilton? Can you raise your hands? So keep them up. We have a few. And how many of you have heard the soundtrack? Keep your hands up. Okay, we have a few more. How many have some vague idea that there's a stage show called Hamilton that you should have heard of? Okay, I think we've got everybody. We've all been touched by the Haminomenon. I gave away the joke. The Hamilton phenomenon, the Haminomenon. I gave away this joke a minute ago when the slide came up early. We saw the show back, now I guess it's about a year and a half ago in Chicago, and we really loved it. But what I want to say about that is that when it comes to the show Hamilton, and when it comes to history versus Hamilton, that it's important to realize that the show is a complex mix of fact and fiction that makes a lot of stuff up and leaves a lot of stuff out. For example, the Alien and Sedition Acts, or the Whiskey Rebellion, or that time that Burr fought a duel with Hamilton's brother-in-law. Don't see that in the show. Or that other time that Burr saved Hamilton's life. And, well, I could go on, but you get the idea. But the great thing about this show is that it's inspired interest in so many people to want to know more about this amazing period, right? You want to be in the room where it happened. And in a very real way, the book that I wrote about Hamilton and Burr owes its existence to Lin-Manuel Miranda and his show. And as it happens, it also avenges a wrong done to me by Richard Dreyfuss, the actor. Inadvertently done to me. And it allows me to name drop two celebrities who I have never met. As an author, I got I started my career as a journalist, working in radio and television. Then I became co-owner of an ad agency and finally found my calling at about age 40, which is an astonishingly long time ago, of making films and writing books about history. And as an author, I got my start by writing the book series that Liz referred to, The Greatest Stories Never Told. And in March of 2016, with Hamilton being the hottest ticket in town, the editor of my first book series, who's now a publisher, called me up and invited me to write about this rivalry. Now, I don't know how much you guys know about the publishing business. I talked to somebody in the back who's involved in publishing. Usually it's the writer begging the publisher to publish their book. So when the publisher calls you and asks you if you want to write a book, there's only one possible answer. Yes. Okay. So I said yes. But it was challenging because they wanted this book quickly. They had a hurry-up deadline. But I had an ace up my sleeve, because a dozen years before, I was supposed to make a documentary about this duel for the History Channel, for the 200th anniversary of the duel, which would have been in 2004. And I was all set. I was reading the books. I was pre-interviewing people. And everything had happened except the signing of the contract. And all of a sudden, actor Richard Dreyfuss decided that he wanted to make a show about Hamilton and Burr for the History Channel. And you're never going to believe this. But for some reason or another, they decided to go with Richard Dreyfuss instead of going with me. Still kind of burned up about it. And so that was bad news then, but it was good news now, because it meant that I had a head start on this book. And that was pretty important because I had to write it in 4 months. That's the deadline I had. And with a 120-day deadline and a 200-page limit, I clearly was not going to write the expansive, 1,000-page version of this story. It was going to have to really focus on the things that people wanted to know about most. Focus on the good stuff. So I think it ended up being a really good thing for me. And my goal was to bring to vivid life the most important parts of this story. And I had 2 other thoughts in mind as well as I started the book. And the first was, I wanted to take the founders off the pedestal. When we think of the founding fathers, we often think of a painting like this one. This is a painting that depicts Jefferson and Adams and Franklin and others presenting the Declaration of Independence to the Continental Congress. And in this painting, the founders sit there. They are formal, and they are dignified, and they are solemn, and they are thinking deep thoughts about America. And I think this is a tremendous misimpression, a wrong image. These guys were not statues. They were flesh and blood, human beings. And robing them in marble does nothing to help us understand them. It robs them of their humanity. They were filled with jealousy and ambition and anger and ego. They were a pretty fractious bunch. And that's exactly how I wanted to present them. I mean, we don't often think about George Washington cursing a blue streak like he did at the Battle of Monmouth. One officer said that he looked like thunder right before the lightning flash. Or Thomas Jefferson whining about the length of cabinet meetings and whining about the length of speeches that other people at those cabinet meetings, Alexander Hamilton, were making. And we don't think of John Adams making caustic and vulgar remarks like the remark he made about Hamilton, blaming his behavior on, and I quote here, a superabundance of excretions which he could not find whores enough to draw off. I am quoting John Adams. We have a president who says some very interesting things now via Twitter. John Adams could give him a run for his money. Adams is one of 5 presidents who are in the book. Washington, Adams, Jefferson, Madison, and Monroe. 4 of them get into a shouting match before the book is over, and the 5th one earns the nickname the Big Knife, that's James Madison, for his ability to cut deals. These guys were very human, warts and all, no different than you and I in many respects, no different than many of our politicians today. And listen, that's the thing that I think is so amazing. Because it's not deus ex machina, God drops them down to earth, magically, and they make our country. They are flawed human beings, and yet they get together, and they still manage to create the framework of the United States of America, which is, I just think, a fabulous thing to think about and understand. The second thing I wanted to do, and again, my presentation tonight has a mind of its own, so, it's a bumpy ride, stick with me. The second thing I wanted to try to do is be objective, okay? History and popular culture have made Aaron Burr the bad guy in this story. Most authors who write about it take sides, and most of them take Hamilton's side, like Ron Chernow did. Burr is portrayed as one of the twin bad boys of early American history, along with Benedict Arnold. And if you're looking for a good conspiracy theory, Aaron Burr, when he was 19 years old, was an aide to General Benedict Arnold. Anyway, people like to portray Burr as the villain. For example, a certain author put it this way. History, he said, has tagged Aaron Burr as a scoundrel, and history has it right. It's never going to come up when I'm on it. But if we start by viewing Aaron Burr as the villain, then everything has to fit that narrative. And it just isn't that simple. Because Hamilton was a visionary doesn't mean automatically Burr is the villain. So I thought it was important not to go into this with the ideas expressed by that author. It's really not going to come up, huh? It's a crisis. It's a crisis. I'm going to come up and do it over here because I think it's going to be a little more successful from here. There you go. Maybe I should do the whole talk from here. I just have to run back and look at the notes every once in a while. Anyway, I thought it was important not to go into it with the ideas expressed by this author, even though, as it happens, I am this author. So I wrote that a number of years ago. So I guess I had some biases coming into this. But I tried to put them aside and approach Burr as an objective reporter. And in fact, Aaron Burr was a war hero, a feminist, an abolitionist, a supporter of immigrant rights, a political innovator, a man, a patron of the arts, a good family man. So in many ways, he is a very admirable character. And giving Burr his due makes for a better story and a better understanding of history. So the book that I wrote, Rivals Unto Death, zeroes in on the interactions between the two. And it's structured as a countdown. So the chapters actually count down from 10 to 1. I had a reviewer on Goodreads who was looking at the book, and they made a comment. They said, the chapters are backwards. At first I thought it was an accident, but then I think he did it on purpose. I want to assure you, I did it on purpose. And the idea is, for each chapter, I wanted to say how long it is until the duel takes place. Because this is a countdown. This is a story with a time bomb under the table. And I wanted readers to be aware as they're reading and keep in mind that destination that we're all headed towards. So, okay, let's talk about these two men. Both of them were orphans, but from very, very different backgrounds. All right, we're going to get there, folks. We're going to get there. Alexander Hamilton was born on the Caribbean island of Nevis. His mother never married his father. She died when he was 13. He came to New York as an impoverished orphan and eventually entered Columbia at the age of 18. And I have in that paragraph shortcutted a real horror story of Alexander Hamilton's youth. And the opening song of the musical pretty much has it right. I mean, people are dying, people who are taking care of him are committing suicide. I mean, he comes out of nowhere because of his intellect and because of his force of character to be able to get to New York and get started. But Aaron Burr is an orphan also. He was born, however, into a prominent family. His maternal grandfather was the famous theologian Jonathan Edwards. His father, also named Aaron Burr, was president of what would become Princeton College, Princeton University. But both of his parents died when he was just a little boy. He was raised by an uncle. And Aaron Burr graduated from Princeton at the age of 16. You know, one thing that's interesting about the musical is it portrays Aaron Burr as being sort of older and wiser than the fresh young face of Alexander Hamilton. In fact, Hamilton is older than Burr. He's a year older than Aaron Burr. So you have two young men, two prodigies, two young men in a hurry. And it's not precisely clear when they first met, but their lives start to intertwine during the Revolution. And the first time that I can determine for sure that they were in the same place at the same time was September 15th, 1776, during one of the most desperate hours of the Battle of New York. Now, how many people here consider themselves really familiar with the Battle of New York? I'm looking around. That's about the normal number of hands we get. The Battle of New York is the biggest battle in the American Revolution. 35,000 British soldiers and sailors versus a ragtag army of 25,000 under George Washington. It lasts for months. It starts in the summer. It starts in Brooklyn. It goes into Manhattan. It goes up into Harlem, and eventually across into New Jersey. It's parts of it, there's a battle in White Plains. Why do none of us hardly know anything about the Battle of New York? Why? I need to know. Why? Somebody know? Did I hear it? Because we lost. Because we got creamed. So we don't want to remember the Battle of New York. We remember the Battle of Trenton. We remember Saratoga. We remember battles where we remember Lexington, where 75 colonials are involved versus 25,000 in New York. But we remember the battles that we won. We didn't actually win Lexington, but we conquered. We won the day. We remember the battles that we won. We don't remember the Battle of New York. But it was during the Battle of New York that Burr and Hamilton first came together. They were both officers in the Continental Army. And it's on this day, September 14th, September 15th, 1776. This is the day that the British invaded Manhattan. And so they crossed over, they landed in Kips Bay, around where 34th Street is now. Washington tries to rally the troops up at about 42nd Street, about where the New York Public Library is now. And his militia flees up Broadway. They don't even put up a fight, they run away. And Washington is so angry, he flings his hat to the ground in disgust. "Good God," he exclaimed, "have I got such troops as these?" And by late afternoon, all of the American troops had fled up to Harlem, except for one contingent near what is modern-day Chinatown. And Aaron Burr goes to try to, he's a staff officer, he goes to try to get that contingent of soldiers to join the rest of Washington's army in Harlem. And the commander won't do it, he's going to fight to the death. So Burr concocts a little ruse. He rides away, and he rides back 10 minutes later. Now he's not making a suggestion. "I have orders, from General Washington that you need to retreat." So now this fellow, he had no orders like that, of course, he made it up. This fellow now retreats up to Harlem. Why is this important? It's because in this contingent of soldiers, there is a young lieutenant named Alexander Hamilton. So if Burr didn't do what he did that day, it's very likely that Alexander Hamilton would have been captured or killed by the British. And history would be completely different. Don't see that in the musical, do you? It's not there. Hamilton and Burr were each offered a chance to serve on General Washington's staff during the Revolution, but it led to very different results. Hamilton, let me start with Burr actually. Burr spent 10 days on Washington's staff in the summer of 1776, left in a huff, and left with a lifelong enmity towards George Washington. Alexander Hamilton joined Washington's staff the following year, spent 4 years on Washington's staff, and became his lifelong protege and his most important aide. And over the years, this fundamental divide over Washington pushed them in different political directions. I think it's a really important part of their relationship. Hamilton becomes a Federalist, a believer in a strong government. As Washington's aide, he saw the need for a strong government to support the army. Burr drifts into the opposition camp, the Democrat-Republicans fighting against the strong Federalist government. And I think that this conflict over Washington drives a wedge between Burr and Hamilton politically from the very beginning, and ultimately a personal wedge as well. Now, after the war, in 1783, they both start practicing in New York City, but it's a very different New York City than we know today. First of all, there's 15,000 people live in New York City in that year. How many people live in Wakefield? A lot bigger than New York City, right? 15,000 people. My favorite statistic in this is that at that time in New York City, there are about a dozen lawyers. You can go into Starbucks on Wall Street and have a dozen lawyers ahead of you in the coffee line. So naturally, as lawyers in New York, Burr and Hamilton As lawyers in New York, Burr and Hamilton come to know each other quite well. Give me one moment. I keep looking for the place here where I can put this. I'm afraid I'll tilt this. It's always fun to try to drop a glass of water on the podium. So naturally, as lawyers in New York, Burr and Hamilton know each other quite well. They're in the courtrooms together, they're in the drawing rooms together. They are trying cases with each other and against each other. And they actually went to each other's houses. They had dinner at each other's houses. But they presented quite a contrast. Burr was almost casual in his appearance. He was careless about the way he dressed, about the way he took care of his hair. He had a look of elegant nonchalance. Hamilton took his look very seriously. He believed that smart clothes were essential. He wore elegant suits, often suits tailored by a French tailor. And this is fascinating. He had his hair groomed every day by a hairdresser. As I'm sure you all do too, as I look out and see, right? They also had a different style in the courtroom. And let me read you a brief excerpt about that contrasting style at the bar there. Hamilton was combative in court, wearing down the other side with beautifully realized but lengthy arguments. He was already exhibiting the take-no-prisoners style that was to alienate so many. He was not content with knocking his opponent in the head, said his friend and fellow attorney Robert Troup, but persisted until he had banished every little insect that buzzed around the ears. The urbane Burr tended to be more persuasive, tapping into the emotions of jurors. He was also much briefer in his delivery. Burr would say as much in half an hour as Hamilton in 2 hours, said one observer who knew and admired them both. Attorney John Van Ness Yates, watching them both in court one day, said that Hamilton appealed to the head, while Burr enslaved the heart. Hamilton himself was fascinated by Burr's courtroom performances. He found Burr's style concise and pleasing, but added, "When I analyzed his arguments, I could never discern in what his greatness consisted." So, here you have two young men on the rise, both lawyers, both working their way up the political ladder. Hamilton, of course, becomes Secretary of the Treasury. He writes the Federalist Papers. Burr becomes Attorney General for New York State and then becomes a senator for New York. There are things pulling them apart. There are things bringing them together. But when Burr explores a run for president in 1792, Hamilton doesn't just oppose him. He goes ballistic. And let me read you another excerpt about that. Hamilton's rage exploded onto the page in an extended rant that he shared privately with his closest allies. Burr was unprincipled, both as a public and private man, Hamilton wrote. He is for or against nothing, but as it suits his interest and ambition. He is determined, as I conceive, to make his way to the head of the popular party and to climb to the highest honors of the state and as much higher as circumstances will allow. Burr, he said, was trying to play the game of confusion, and he had a religious duty to oppose his career. Now, this is 12 years before they fight a duel, and Hamilton is painting Burr as a soul beyond redemption. And why does he feel so strongly? Well, for one thing, when Burr ran for senator, he ran against Hamilton's father-in-law, Philip Schuyler. So Hamilton saw that as a betrayal. But there's something deeper going on here, I believe. Alexander Hamilton viewed politics as a sacred mission. He had fixed principles that he fought for with all the passion that he could muster. Aaron Burr saw politics as a career, something to do the best you could in, to get as far ahead as you could in. His allegiances were much more flexible. So when Hamilton looked at Burr, he saw a man with no fixed ideology other than winning. And I think it drove him a little crazy. I think it earned Burr special scorn in Hamilton's pantheon of villains. And Burr, in turn, came to see Hamilton as a zealot, a fanatic, and as well as an ally of his old enemy Washington, who kept getting in his way. So from then on, they were implacable enemies until the duel at Weehawken 12 years later. Except no, not. One of the most fascinating things about this story is the ups and downs, the fact that they're divided, and then they come tantalizingly close to joining each other as allies. To tell you about that, I want to fast forward to a scene in 1797, 7 years to the day before the duel between Hamilton and Burr, in which Hamilton is getting into a dust-up with another founding father, James Monroe. I'm getting some good exercise in there too, which is nice. Tuesday morning, July 11th, 1797, Hamilton was trembling with rage. The target of his anger was future President James Monroe, who's not there. He was there for a moment. Who had just returned from Europe upon being recalled as minister to France. When Hamilton accused Monroe of being a liar, the Virginian became equally incensed. The two men leapt out of their chairs and began screaming at each other. "Do you say I represented falsely? You are a scoundrel," Monroe shouted. "I will meet you like a gentleman," Hamilton retorted. "I am ready. Get your pistols," Monroe fired back. Anger management, people. The subject of Hamilton and Monroe's argument that day in 1797 was the first great political sex scandal in American history. Alexander Hamilton had an affair with a young married woman named Maria Reynolds. And shortly after he began this affair, Maria Reynolds' husband, James Reynolds, began blackmailing Hamilton over the affair, with the knowledge of, and most likely the consent of, his wife. A charming couple, the Reynolds. Wonderful footnote characters to American history. And we know all about this affair because Alexander Hamilton wrote a 90-page treatise about it called the Reynolds Pamphlet. And he did this, believe it or not, to defend himself. He thought people were charging him with having paid Reynolds as part of a corruption scheme. And so he's saying, no, no, no. You see, I was not corrupt as Secretary of Treasury paying off Reynolds. I'm simply debauched in my private life, so it's all quite understandable. As one Republican editor described his defense, he said it boiled down to Hamilton saying, I am a rake, and therefore cannot be a swindler. So you know how they say it's the crime, not the cover-up? I think Alexander Hamilton should have done a little more covering up in this case. Because nobody bought this defense. And it put him in a lot of hot water. Now, for reasons that I detail in the book, Hamilton blames Monroe for the news of this affair getting out. And it looks like they're going to be fighting a duel. So James Monroe decides that he needs to have a second to negotiate for him as they're on their way to having a duel. And who do you think he picks? Aaron Burr. And now Aaron Burr is holding Hamilton's life in his hands again, in a sense, right? Because if there's a duel there, Hamilton could be at risk. And in fact, Burr manages to straighten things out and avoid a duel, which Hamilton appreciates. And now there's a new rapprochement between the two men. They start working together again. Friends notice them acting buddy-buddy. They serve on a committee together. Hamilton tries to get Burr a job with an army that's being formed to fight the French. It doesn't work out, but if that rapprochement had continued, I think things would have been very, very different. As the book counts down, the presidential election of 1800 looms very large, since it comes just 4 years before the face-off in Weehawken, and once again has Hamilton and Burr as main characters. And let me set the scene of this presidential election for you. The president is John Adams, crotchety, brilliant, a Federalist, and he and his party have been wielding the Alien and Sedition Acts to crush all dissent. And it's actually a pretty scary time in America because people who are criticizing the president are quite literally being locked up in jail. Congressmen, newspaper editors, and Federalist zeal in these prosecutions knows no bounds. One case involved a couple of tipplers outside a tavern in Newark, New Jersey, who were amused by the spectacle of John Adams' presidential carriage going along and a 16-gun salute being fired. "There goes the president, and they are firing at his ass," bellowed Brown Clark. "I don't care if they fire through his ass," responded his drinking companion Luther Baldwin. And guess what? Both those guys went to jail for making those remarks and had to pay a fine. So Republicans feared that if Adams won re-election, that he would really clamp down. It would lead to tyranny and one-party rule. So they put up Thomas Jefferson as their candidate. Well, Federalists thought Thomas Jefferson was Satan, basically. They were scared that if Jefferson became president, he would import the French Revolution to the shores of America, and it would tear the country to shreds. I did most of the writing of this book during the summer of 2016. I don't know if you recall, there was another presidential election going on that year. And it was pretty amazing to be writing about the election of 1800 at the same time that I was witnessing the election of 2016. And let me give you an example. When I turned in the original manuscript in September of 2016, I referred to the election of 1800 as the wildest election in American history. When I did the revisions about 6 weeks later, mid-October, I referred to it as one of the wildest. Because I was no longer sure it was the wildest, but it was pretty wild. I'm not sure which of those elections still is the wildest and most alarming. But let me give you a sense of what made the election of 1800 so wild. The fervent belief that so much was at stake, indeed, that the fate of the new nation might be in peril, fueled unparalleled personal attacks and stirred deep-seated paranoia. President Adams was decried as a warmonger, a tyrant, a criminal. Republican editor James Callender mocked him as a poor old man and a hideous hermaphroditical character. It was a happier, simpler time. Jefferson was labeled an atheist, and apocalyptic prophecies were made about a Jefferson presidency. Murder, robbery, rape, adultery, and incest will all be openly taught and practiced, predicted the Connecticut Current, a newspaper which still exists today as the Hartford Current. The air will be rent with the cries of distress, the soil will be soaked with blood, and the nation black with crimes. Fake news? Reverend Thomas Dwight, president of Yale. Do we have any Yale graduates here? No, none who will admit it. Okay. Reverend Thomas Dwight, president of Yale, blustered that under a Jefferson presidency we may see the Bible cast into the bonfire. We may see our wives and daughters the victims of legal prostitution. Housewives in New England buried their Bibles in the gardens, convinced that as president, Jefferson would confiscate them. If you live in an old house, you want to check the garden when you get home tonight, dig down, see if you find anything. So let me shortcut to the end of this election story. The election ends in a tie. The election of 1800 ends in a tie, but it does not end in a tie between the two candidates, Jefferson and Adams, oddly enough. It ends in a tie between Jefferson and his running mate. Because there's a quirk in the Electoral College. at that time, they fixed it since, that he and his vice presidential candidate each have the same number of electoral votes, 73 electoral votes. And so the way the Constitution was written at that time, the votes count the same for president or vice president. It's a tie, and the race has to be decided by the House of Representatives. And of course, Thomas Jefferson's running mate in the election of 1800 is Aaron Burr. Now, virtually every single Federalist in Congress prefers Aaron Burr to Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson, remember, they think he's the devil. He's going to bring the French Revolution. Burr, yeah, he's somebody we think we can work with. Right? We're not sure that he really believes that stuff he's saying, so we'd rather have him in office. I think almost every Federalist in the country preferred Burr to Jefferson. And so Congress, all the Federalists vote for Burr, all the Democrat Republicans vote for Jefferson, and they're voting by state, and it's a tie. And it's a tie for 33 ballots. And it's an incredible story. There literally is a congressman who has got the pivotal vote in his state, and he's deathly ill, and they're bringing him in on a stretcher every day so that he can be there to cast his vote. That's how important these guys thought it was. Now, there's one Federalist in the United States of America, one prominent Federalist, who is absolutely opposed to Aaron Burr. You have any idea who that might be? His name is Alexander Hamilton. Hamilton, listen, Hamilton was no friend of Jefferson. They'd served in the cabinet together. They tussled a lot. In fact, 4 years earlier, in 1796, when Jefferson was a presidential candidate running against Adams, Hamilton said, all personal and partial considerations must be discarded, and everything must give way to the great object of excluding Jefferson. But that was 4 years ago. Things change. This is politics. You can take a different point of view. And now in 1800, Alexander Hamilton is singing a different song. There is no doubt, he says, that upon every prudent and virtuous calculation, Jefferson is to be preferred. He is by far not so dangerous a man. And he is writing this privately. He's not giving news conferences. He's writing this privately to Federalists in Washington, Federalists all over. And eventually, his words helped convince one Federalist congressman in Delaware to change his vote and to vote for Jefferson. And that changes everything. And on the 33rd ballot, the House of Representatives makes Thomas Jefferson the President of the United States. And while Hamilton's attacks were in private letters, it seems highly probable that they got back to Burr anyway. But the thing is, it wasn't Burr's style really to respond like with an angry rant on Facebook or write a letter to the editor. There was a great quote about Aaron Burr that while others debate, Burr resolves, while others resolve, Burr acts. And Burr's icy resolve in this case was ultimately to prove the undoing of Alexander Hamilton. A lot happens in the 3 years between this election and the duel at Weehawken, bitter governor's race in New York, the so-called pamphlet wars, all sorts of other things that sharpen the antagonism between the two men. But for now, let's fast forward one last time to the fateful summer of 1804 and the famous duel between Alexander Hamilton and Aaron Burr. Oh, thank you. For such a major historical event, this duel has a pretty ridiculous proximate cause. A doctor named Charles Cooper, a New York doctor, was attending a dinner that Hamilton was also attending. And he wrote a letter saying that he heard Hamilton remark that he considered Burr a dangerous man and one not to be trusted. Now that's not the problem. That line wasn't the problem. But then Cooper added, I could detail to you a still more despicable opinion which General Hamilton has expressed of Mr. Burr. And that's the phrase that triggered the duel. those 5 words, a still more despicable opinion. Now, by accident or by design, this letter ends up being published in a newspaper in Albany. And by the time that Burr saw it, he was in a pretty foul state of mind. He was still vice president, but Thomas Jefferson had decided that he was going to dump Burr from the ticket when he ran for re-election. And so Burr was looking for another job, so he'd run for governor of New York, and it was a really vicious race. He endured all sorts of brutal insults and attacks. He lost, Burr lost, and he was really angry and enraged about it. He was kind of like a wounded tiger. He was looking for somebody to fight back against, and that's when he saw this letter. And he wrote a letter to Alexander Hamilton and basically said, what do you mean by a more despicable opinion? You know, can you tell me, are you making an attack on my character? And Hamilton responds with this letter that basically is filled with legalistic nitpicking and kind of toys with Burr. And from there, things spiral downward in the following 3 weeks until the 2 men are meeting on the dueling ground on July 11th, 1804 in Weehawken, New Jersey. And those, you know, the thing that people want to know about this duel, I think, the question that I get the most often is who fired the first shot? And I think the reason that this is such a burning question is that it serves as a proxy for another question, which is who's to blame? Did Aaron Burr murder Alexander Hamilton in cold blood? Should we blame Aaron Burr? Or did Hamilton fire first and thus justify Burr's response? And I don't hold with the idea of judging this based on who fired first. I think you have to look at the 30 years. I think you have to look at the 3 weeks of notes between them, which was really quite amazing. And in the book, the last chapter counts this down literally day by day to see the back and forth between these 2 guys and how events cascade towards ultimate disaster. But the question of who fired first is certainly one that is loaded with significance. So let's take a look at what we know. There are 4 people present at the duel. I know there are 5 in this image behind me. There's not really a good, accurate image of this duel. There are 4 people present, the 2 men and their seconds. There is a 5th person involved, Dr. Hossack, but he's not there at the moment. He is actually down below so that he has plausible deniability. He's not going to actually see who fires the shot, but he's going to be there to treat somebody if they're hit. So there are 4 men present, the 2 principals and the 2 seconds. The second being your assistant, essentially, your aide for the duel. And one of those 4 people is mortally wounded. And doesn't have a whole lot coherent to say about what happened. Diametrically opposed versions of the stories emerge from the other 3 people. So Hamilton's second, Nathaniel Pendleton, emphatically declared that Burr fired first, and that Hamilton only fired after the musket ball from Burr's pistol hit him in the abdomen. And they are absolutely determined that that's his story, Nathaniel Pendleton. Burr's second, and Aaron Burr himself, give the opposite story. They say that Hamilton fired first, and that 3 or 4 seconds went by before Burr fired back. Further, actually, there's an exchange of letters between Burr and his second in which his second asks Burr, Van Ness is his second, he asks Burr, why did you wait so long before you fired? And Burr said, I was waiting for the smoke to clear, and it didn't seem like that long to me. So we have 2 diametrically opposed versions of the story. Who are you going to believe? So the question is, what other evidence can we bring to this? And there are several other factors to look at. I outlined them all in the book. Let me touch on 2 of the most significant tonight. 1, Hamilton proclaimed to his second and wrote in a letter that he left to his wife to give to her if he died, that he was not going to fire, but that he was going to throw away his shot. He said, if it pleases God to give me the opportunity, it pleased God to give me the opportunity to reserve and throw away my first fire. And I have thoughts even of reserving my second fire. So from this we might take that Alexander Hamilton did not plan on firing first, therefore Burr must have fired first. But I would add two commentaries to that. One is, it's one thing the night before to say that you are not going to fire first. It's another if I'm standing here 30 feet away from you pointing a pistol at you, you might change your mind and decide at that moment that firing first is a good idea. The second thing is, it's really important to remember that Hamilton did not say this publicly. So there would be no way that Aaron Burr knew that that's what Hamilton wanted to do. Number two, the incident with the glasses. Just before they were about to start the duel, just before Nathaniel Pendleton was ready to shout present, when everything was ready, Alexander Hamilton called out, "Stop!" And everyone was startled. Everybody looked at him. What's going on? And he says, in certain states of the light, one requires glasses. And then this amazing series of events, this amazing episode happens. He's not wearing glasses at the time. I now can't see anything. But he takes his glasses out of his pocket. He's still got his pistol in his hand. And he's putting the glasses on. He demonstrates. He still has his pistol. And he's aiming it. Okay, so better with the glasses. Can I hit you better with the glasses? And then eventually he decides he's going to go with the glasses. And he puts them on. And now they can get ready and have the duel. "This will do now," he said. "You may proceed." Now it's instructive to look at this from Aaron Burr's point of view. If you're Aaron Burr and I'm doing this to you, what are you going to be thinking? You might be thinking, this guy really wants to kill me. He's doing everything he can to put me on the spot. So you might be jacking up your adrenaline and getting you quite ready to fire back. And even if, in that scenario, even if Burr did fire first, it might be because he thought that was the only way that he could defend his own life. There are other factors as well. The hair trigger on the pistols, Hamilton's comments, his delirious comments in the boat on the way back and in his sickbed in Manhattan, the back and forth sniping between the seconds, it's all laid out in the book. I wanted to not draw a conclusion, but let people draw their own conclusions. Because I think that more than 200 years later, it's really impossible to know exactly what happened. And I think that if you have a strongly held opinion about what happened, it probably represents that you either really like Alexander Hamilton or you're really like Aaron Burr, and so your opinion is affected by that. When I reflect on this story, I can't help but wonder what would have happened if there had been no duel, if Hamilton and Burr had managed to patch up their differences. And I'm not the first person to wonder about this. President John Adams wondered about the same thing. What would have been the consequences, he said. Shall I say that Hamilton would have been now alive, and Hamilton and Burr now at the head of our affairs? What then? The president's words are something to consider. Both men were still in their 40s at the time of the duel, with plenty left to contribute to the fledgling nation. And it's very possible that if they had not dueled, that one of them might have become president. Their political careers were both pretty much at a dead end at that point, but there have been far more unlikely comebacks in American political history. So to me, when I look at the story, it's very sad that they were so consumed by animosity and jealousy and their conception of honor that both men ended up losers that morning. Today, in 2018, far beyond the glow of Broadway, this is a piece of history that I think is still vitally relevant to us. Many of the issues are the same: big government versus small government, elites versus the common people, the national debt, immigration, the Electoral College, freedom of the press. Believe me, they had as much problem with the Electoral College in 1800 as people did in 2018. It is startling to me that we are still arguing about the same things over and over. The story of Alexander Hamilton and Aaron Burr is an inspiration, a warning, a tragedy, a murder mystery, and a primer on early American history. And it's a story that has it all: violence, politics, jealousy, sex, and guys wearing wigs. It is vastly entertaining, but it is also very revealing about our country and ourselves. It's been a great pleasure to distill it into this little book and to talk with you about it tonight. Thank you very much. Plenty of time for questions. And so do we have any questions? We have a lot of, I'm going to start in the back. I never do that, but I'll start way in the back.
At the time, was it a common practice to practice dueling beforehand?
Question is whether it was a common practice to practice dueling before you were in a duel. It was a little bit of bad form, I think. Hamilton's supporters spread rumors that Aaron Burr had been practicing before this duel as a way to try to disgrace him after the duel. So I don't think that that was, if you did practice, you tried to do so in secrecy and not let anybody know about it. We have another question here. My way this way. Go ahead.
I've read somewhere that the reason the Constitution requires presidents to be American-born was the fact that when the Constitution was put together, they didn't want Hamilton to ever become president. They knew that he had not been born in America. Is that true?
The question is whether the demand in the Constitution that presidents be American-born in the United States is because they were trying to keep Alexander Hamilton out because they knew that he was born in Nevis. I do not believe that's true. The way the Constitution is worded and the way it was interpreted, it was basically they counted anybody who was an American citizen or a citizen of their state at the time that at the time that the revolution took place would be considered eligible to be president. So since Hamilton was a citizen of New York before the revolution took place, I believe he was eligible to be president. And you never see, I've never seen any document of anyone suggesting at that time, Jefferson, Burr, any of the many, many, many enemies that Hamilton had, that he was not eligible. I mean, nobody in 1776 had been born in the United States. There was no United States. So if you go back and you look at the way that it's worded, and I don't have the exact wording in my memory, it is inclusive of people who are essentially in the United States at that moment. And then after that, after the United States exists, then it's people born in the United States. I'm not a constitutional scholar, but pretty close on that. Go ahead.
Are the pistols still around?
The pistols are still around. They are ensconced in a bank in New York City. Both Hamilton and Burr started banks that still exist today. The bank that Hamilton started is now a BNY Mellon, I think. It was the Bank of New York for many years. And the Manhattan Company that Burr started is Chase Manhattan, and they have the pistols. They have the pistols. The pistols belonged to Alexander Hamilton's brother-in-law, John Barker Church, although, oddly enough, we do not believe they were the pistols that were used when John Barker Church dueled with Aaron Burr at that same spot in Weehawken I think it was in 1799. Aaron Burr only fought 2 duels against Alexander Hamilton and Alexander Hamilton's brother-in-law. Never fought, never took part, never was a second in any other duel. Alexander Hamilton was involved in 11, I think, duels. The only one of which that came to, that he was a principal in and that came to shooting was the one against Burr. The other ones he was either a second in or they solved it before they ever got to the actual dueling ground. Most duels, and they called them affairs of honor, and most times they were resolved without actually having to resort to shooting. I'll go over here and then I'll get to you, sir. What would happen if they both missed? Well, there was a rule book called the Code Duello, which was published in Ireland, actually not, around 1775, I think it was first published, that laid out the rules for gentlemen in duels. And if both men miss, then their seconds are supposed to get together and once again see if they can now resolve the situation. Has honor been satisfied? Can we walk away? And if not, they are supposed to reload and do it again.
Excuse me, Mr. Beyer?
Yes.
You have a young question.
Oh,
here,
I'm
but I think you can't see us.
Thank you. Thank you for the assistance. Go ahead.
So I was wondering, I've heard different opinions on either one, but was Aaron Burr like a good shot? Was he like
The question is whether Aaron Burr was a good shot, and the only evidence I have suggests yes. Because he hit him. I too have heard different things about what kind of shot each of these people were. I mean, both of them had served in the army. They both were familiar with weapons, but neither of them have been, using one recently to shoot against somebody. And let's keep in mind that the weapons of this time are pretty inaccurate to begin with. It's quite easy to fire a flintlock, smoothbore pistol like this one from at 30 feet or 50 feet away and not to hit something, not to hit your target. And you're not, it's not a rifle, it's not balanced against your shoulder, you're not aiming. There's always a certain amount of luck involved. So I am not sure, but as I say, based on the one shot that I'm aware of, I'd say yes. And now I'll go back to you, sir.
If there was conclusive evidence as to who shot first, would there have been a crime committed?
There was a crime committed. Dueling was illegal, despite what you hear in the musical. I love the musical. I only harass it for fun. But there's this line in the musical where Hamilton and his son say, everything is legal in New Jersey. Dueling was illegal in both New York and New Jersey. Aaron Burr was indicted. He was the Vice President of the United States. He was indicted in both New York and New Jersey. He took off for Georgia to wait for things to cool down. The problem with dueling is that it's very hard to make a case. Who's going to testify? If you killed somebody, the guy who's killed is unlikely to testify. You're unlikely to testify. That leaves it to the seconds. In some cases, the seconds supposedly turned away so that they would not see who fired first. In this case, the seconds both were watching, but it's highly unlikely that they would have been willing to testify. So you kind of have the cases both fell apart, and eventually Burr resumed his duties as vice president for the remainder of his term. So, I'm going to keep going over, and then I'll come back if there's anybody else over here. What did the press of the Times say? I know, what did the newspapers say at the time, and did they take sides? I know that this is going to come as a terrible, terrible shock to you. But there was press that was in favor of one party and press that was in favor of another party. I know that that's unimaginable today. But they all were against Aaron Burr. And why is that? Great thing about this story, Hamilton is besieged and politically kind of dead in the water at this time of his life. And he's got a lot of enemies. And then he is shot, and overnight he's a martyr. And overnight, everybody is, we love Alexander Hamilton, amazing funeral for him in New York City. The bells of the churches all tolling for hours. So, of course, the Federalists and the Federalist press, they were enraged that Aaron Burr had done this. But, keep in mind that the Democrat Republicans, Thomas Jefferson's party, they were irritated at Burr because he had sort of encouraged people to support him for president against Jefferson, because he'd been trying to get Federalist support in his race for governor. So they saw this as a great way to kind of eliminate Burr as a potential threat to Jefferson. So in a real way, I'm serious about this. The poignant thing about this duel is that there's no way either of them could have won, right? There's no, either one of them killing the other person would probably be it probably would have been just as damaging, if not more so, for Alexander Hamilton if Aaron Burr had died. But the press was all attacking Burr. Burr was quite shocked by this. He didn't see that coming. And he was irritated by it, and then alarmed by it, and then, as I said, took off and headed out of Dodge to Georgia, where in fact many people congratulated him because Alexander Hamilton was still hated by many people in the South for his role in the assumption of debt.
What happened to Burr afterwards?
What happened to Aaron Burr afterwards? Aaron Burr lived quite a long life afterwards. So now he's a political pariah. His term as vice president is ending. He's clearly not going to be running for office anymore. He gets involved with this very weird and dubious scheme and conspiracy out in the western states. And by western states, I mean Ohio. Which ends up with Thomas Jefferson charging him with treason. And there's a very famous treason trial. This is not covered in my book, or let's see, I give it a paragraph at the end. There's a very famous treason trial in which John Marshall, the very famous Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, presides. And now, all this stuff, it's all personalities with these people, okay? John Marshall hates Thomas Jefferson. Hates him. John Marshall's a Federalist. He's appointed by Adams. He hates Thomas Jefferson. So Jefferson has accused Burr of treason. So John Marshall finds a technicality in which he can get Burr off, just so he can piss off Thomas Jefferson. Okay, now I'm sure that that's not exactly how his opinion described it. But that's basically what's going on. There's a lot of personal animosities here. At that point, Burr goes to England. He spends a few years in England. He comes back to New York and starts practicing law under another name, under his first wife's maiden name, I think it was, under his mother's maiden name, excuse me. And then, but eventually he resumes his law practice under his own name and is practicing law in New York City for many years. He eventually marries again, and his second wife decides to divorce him, and she hires as an attorney a younger attorney in New York City named Alexander Hamilton. It's Hamilton's son. And that divorce decree comes through on the day that Aaron Burr died. So since we've now taken this story all the way to the ending, Liz, what do you think? Should we wrap it up? Thank you very much. I really appreciate you being here. It's been a great time.